Hello folks, this week we're looking at active transportation, and again pleased to have with us George McKibbon, and I know this is a passion of yours as well, George, in terms of some of the work that he's done professionally and personal interests as well. So what does active transportation mean to you?
Walking, cycling, anything that involves physical locomotion in the landscape.
Yeah, absolutely, and sometimes I think we have active transportation in the way of our day-to-day functions, and then there's also recreational transportation, and there's really similar but a little bit different in their focus, aren't they?
Yes, I go back to that triad that I described earlier. Labor, what you do physically for your own biological requirements, what you do for work, earn a living, provide for your family, your parents, what you do for action within the community, and the way you move physically between different places to perform each of those three tasks. That comprises, in my mind, what active transportation is about.
If we step out of my office here, we're recording here at the University of Guelph, if we step out of my office, we find all kinds of infrastructure in place within the city that contributes to active transportation. Are there any specific challenges that you think small towns or rural spaces have with regard to active transportation?
Car dominance, truck dominance, and not a good appreciation both on the part of walkers and cyclists and vehicular operators as to what are the appropriate behaviors within each of those categories where they affect each other. We're also faced with a design process, particularly in the rural and the small town setting, that is predominantly oriented towards vehicular traffic. The concept that you could drive downtown to do all your stuff as opposed to walking. As a walker in Port Colborne, I've become quite observable. People all around see me walking and consider to be eccentric, which is probably true. But setting that aside, walking is a natural activity. So it shouldn't be seen as an eccentricity. And as a volunteer on Port Colborne's Active Transportation Committee, I realize we're losing so much because Port Colborne is a Lake Erie waterfront area which brings people from the States and Canada each summer, but we don't provide the walking environment, a kind of tactile, visual kind of environment that supports businesses and cultural features that can benefit from that. And we're kind of losing an opportunity because we don't think that walking is functional, but it's an economic driver too, and can support our economic activities in Port Colborne, where recreation and commercial uses associated with that are there and need to be supported.
As you're chatting, there's a couple things running through my mind. One is growing up as a child in rural Ontario, remembering how prevalent trees were along roadsides, and how as a society we've decided that that's a safety hazard, and increasingly those trees have been removed so if vehicles go off the road they're not hitting trees, which is kind of an interesting perspective because it takes us back to some of the ecological determinants of health in terms of that feature in the landscape and it having been gradually removed over time. So I'm just reflecting on that for a second. And the other thing is in rural communities, how people do tend to get in their cars and go places. And yet we see examples in parts of Ontario with the Amish and Mennonite community, how prevalent walking is for that group in society. So just interesting to see those different kinds of things. Really interested in your example of Port Colborne, though. Just, and I know this isn't one of our scripted questions, but what does the Active Transportation Committee that you referred to, what is the work of that committee? Because that's part of how we make active transportation happen.
The challenge we face in Port Colborne is this. On a regional scale, we have an excellent set of trails. linking communities along Lake Erie up the Niagara River to the falls, to Niagara Lake, over to the canal, Welland Canal, and from Port Dalhousie on the north end to Port Colborne on the south. Just an excellent framework. And it brings a lot of people to use that trail system. The difficulty in Port Colborne is those trails come together on the east side of the canal, and they dump people right next to, frankly, dirty industry. There's a lot of track out from the onto the street and a lot of dust. And you cross the canal, you can do that. And then we have a street called West Street, which has a wonderful array of vintage kind of buildings that have been redeveloped for commercial, restaurant uses. And it's just a tremendous resource. We can't maximize that resource because you can't get them off the trails into the town in a way that is really appropriate for the kind of user that and the money they bring that would be supportive of that kind of activity. Similarly, we can't across the town on the west side. We could link up with a trail that could take people right to Dundas, but we have no connection through the urban area of Port Colborne that would allow for those trail users to move through. And we don't have a particularly amenable walking system. We have sidewalks, normal kind of streetlights and the sort. But the concept of using a crosswalk, very poor understanding of what a crosswalk can do and what it can't do, what crossing guards can do and what they can't do. We have school crossings. And the notion of putting in a crosswalk where people have to stop if you're standing there on the edge of the road and cross over, those things are concepts. And pedestrian scramble, for example, in a downtown redevelopment of the street pattern in a business area, we had an opportunity to look at plans that had been done several years ago before pedestrian mobility or cycling were given much credence, and it's very much a car-oriented design. So we made some recommendations, one of which I was quite happy to suggest was use one of the main corners, create a pedestrian scramble, like Dundas and Yonge Street in Toronto. Those scrambles are becoming much more common as you go around the province. I was laughed at by the engineers. Now they weren't P engines; they were CE2s. But when I raised that, I was laughed at. So that's a kind of a barrier. How do you work with all those different things respectfully? I'm a volunteer. I serve at the grace of council. How do you work respectfully with all the different parties to these kinds of decisions to get them to think a bit differently? And that's the challenge I think that we really face.
And so if we think of active transportation and an approach to active transportation, what do you think leads to a successful approach or a successful outcome?
I personally have some doubts about complete streets programs because they focus on the street. I think it has to be a much more inclusive kind of a concept that also incorporates the notion you begin inside a building, you walk out to the street, you walk down the street, and then you walk in another building. So there's a functional element that incorporates the land use. And I think it has to, much more attention has to be placed to air quality. Trees, for example, take particulate out of the atmosphere. They also buffer the noise, the leaves and things like that, and provide background. The tactile, the substance of the street itself, the sidewalk itself, particularly where the crossings are concerned. You might want to think about different tactile. If your mobility impact challenged, visually particularly, the tactile becomes crucial. Sound, got truck traffic out there, you're not going to have a patio. That's Donald Appleyard many years ago in the 70s, 60s, 70s, dealt with that issue of noise and street life. So I think you have to work with all those different elements. There's touch, sight, taste, sound, all those things. And think of it as a kind of an affordance.
Think of this kind of a
affordance. It's an extension of consciousness. That I move around the landscape. And coming back to Lynch's comments, I move around the landscape to either use elements, food, or to do other things. Work with my neighbors to create a building or something like business, religious organization, municipality where you're thinking of the corporate aspect. So as these things become kind of affordances, how we deal with things in the landscape, but they come back to those kinds of elements of consciousness that are framed by sight, noise, taste, touch, things of that nature. In the context of those three components that I described in the rank.
That's excellent. I'm just reflecting, and I think it embodies many of the things you're saying. As I walk into the university in the morning, I live downtown, and I'm able to do about the first third of it on back streets, which is fantastic. The last third is sort of on the university campus itself and on streets that are off the main street. And then the middle third is about 500 meters along Gordon Street, and it's painful. So I can't hear anything. The vehicles are going by at a fast speed. It's just not any fun. Like you sort of live to get to the first third and the last third, but that middle third. And I think it's all of those things that you're saying that you want to try to avoid in active transportation, or conversely provide in active transportation. It's that chunk of highway walking is like. So thank you for that.
I just want to say one other thing. Complete streets is kind of formulaic, and you can apply the formula without thinking about all of those sensory elements. And I think we have to come back to the sensory.
Do you have any examples of of active transportation plans that you really like that stand out for you as having done things well?
The pedestrian mobility plan for the city of Hamilton, rather than trying to set out a kind of a plan for the whole city, what we did was set out a decision-making process.
Okay.
Routine accommodation, we called it. And things you think about whenever you tear the street up for whatever purpose. So when you think of that functional activity, also add on to an analytical procedure which would require you to improve the pedestrian cycling environment when you did that. So that changes would be incorporated as you would change the street for whatever purpose, servicing, traffic, whatever. So that over a period of 20 years, you could actually transform the city into a more walkable, more cycling-friendly environment. That was an innovation we tried in the city of Hamilton, and the city's using it, and it's generated a lot of. It was difficult doing it, thinking it through, because we had to. I don't think anybody had done it that way before, and so we had to step back and sort of take a look at all the various city departments and policies and regulations that apply to the city, and sort of create a whole framework that would work with them so that all of those components would be come to play. But that's my example.
Excellent. I'm reminded of the fact that examples can look quite different. I remember looking at, I think it was one for one of our neighboring counties, and it was somewhere between 300 and 400 pages was the length of the active transportation plan. And I was involved in doing one for the county of Huron, which I think was 15 or 20 pages. And it all depends on the level of depth that you go into, all the way from that individual crossroads or individual intersections to thinking about it more conceptually or from a policy perspective. So the different models that people might be thinking about. And maybe this is my final question. Students are being asked to do, as part of their assignment, select a street or select a neighborhood block perhaps within Guelph or their home community. Do you have any keywords of advice that and I realize that the project the students are being asked to do is, it has to be intentionally constrained. You can't do everything that you would ideally do, but what do you think 2 or 3 of the key things they might look for in doing a mini active transportation plan?
3 things. One is take the urban transit.
Okay, urban transit.
And place your whatever street or neighborhood that you're thinking about on that.
And by that you mean the urban transit is sort of that downtown core to the subdivision to rural eventually. And where does your block fit within that overall scheme of things? Good point.
And when you do that, secondly, you can characterize the kind of urban form or development pattern that is, and you can work with that particular characterization, and then apply the sensory elements that I talked about: sight, hearing, taste, and tactile, touch to that element, and then think about how that might improve the walkability and the cycling capacity of that.
That's great. So that was the transit and the tactile components, the touch,
But within that transect, you'll find that traditionally, there'll be some advantages and disadvantages associated with the historic pattern that has developed. For example, intersection density becomes really important. The only place where you get high intersection density per square kilometer is in the downtown, where there are a lot of intersections that are very close together, and you get kind of square blocks. 1880s to 1910, you get rectangular. 1910, 1920 on, you get begin to get the kind of curvilinear street patterns that are oriented towards suburban and automobile. And then beyond, you've got a kind of mishmash of everything. But those are the kinds of things, and you'll find that things like street width vary, the kind of building, where they're situated in terms of sidewalk setbacks and the like. And they all pose advantages and disadvantages, which have different sensory advantages and disadvantages. And if you use that kind of formula, you can work that way.
Well, once again, thanks to George. As a reminder, George is a private planning consultant and has played a big role with OPPI and with CIP in helping to develop their documents around the healthy communities. And again, thanks, George.